She refused a duke. He disappeared for 3 years. Then her father's debt showed up, already paid. No name attached. No explanation. Just gone. And the only man in Bath who could have done it is pretending he didn't. She's going to find out why. He's going to have to decide how much of the truth she can handle. So are you. The Pump Room, Bath, October 1818. The pump room smelled of sulphur and old money, and Constance Hartley had made her peace with both. She lifted the glass, drank obediently, and set it down before Phoebe Ainsworth could ask whether the waters had cured her of anything yet. "Only my patience," Constance said. "That was gone before we arrived." Phoebe surveyed the room over the rim of her own glass. "You have the look of a woman being watched." "I am always being watched. My father's money makes sure of it." It was true and had been true for 3 years, since Josiah Hartley had taken his fortune out of Bristol warehouses and put it into a house on Laura Place, and decided that Bath would launch his daughter properly into a world that still flinched at the smell of trade on new money. Constance had stopped minding the stairs. She had not stopped noticing them. "Mr. Coles dines with your father again on Thursday," Phoebe said, with the studied idleness of someone dropping a stone into still water to watch the rings. "4 times this month. My father enjoys his company." "So your father enjoys his 400 a year." Phoebe's gaze moved past Constance's shoulder and stopped. "You're about to mind something else entirely." Constance did not need to turn round. She felt it the way one feels weather changing, a pressure shift in the room, conversations thinning, a dozen fans slowing mid-stroke. She turned anyway, because not turning would have told him something she preferred to keep to herself. Gideon Marlowe, Duke of Alderley, crossed the pump room the way he did everything, as though it cost him nothing, which she happened to know was a lie. "Miss Hartley," he bowed precisely as much as manners required and not a fraction more. "You are looking well." "You sound surprised." "I am relieved. Bath air does not agree with everyone." A pause waited. "You once told me you would rather live out your days unmarried in a garret than endure a single season here." "I have revised my opinion of garrets." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the ghost of the argument they used to have for sport, before it had stopped being sport. Phoebe watched them both with open interest and said nothing, which from Phoebe was its own kind of commentary. "And your father?" Gideon asked. "Is he well?" "Perfectly." The word came out faster than she intended. He held her eyes a moment too long, as though he might ask again differently. Then a gentleman at his elbow murmured something about a subscription list, and Gideon reached into his coat, not for a card case, but for a small notebook bound in worn brown leather, and wrote a line in it without looking down. Constance's stomach dropped the way it had dropped 3 years ago, in a drawing room in Bristol, when she had glimpsed that same notebook open on a side table. "Miss Hartley, Miss Ainsworth." Another bow and he was gone, back into the crowd that parted for him, the way crowds always did. Phoebe waited until he was out of earshot. "You went white." "I did not." "You went the particular white you go when you're pretending very hard not to feel something." She did not press further, only tucked her arm through Constance's and steered her toward the doors, patient, the way she was patient with a horse she meant to ride later. Bristol 3 years earlier, October 1815. The drawing room at the old Hartley house on Queen Square had smelled of beeswax and the river, and Josiah's ledgers had still been open on the desk when the Duke of Alderley was announced. Constance had been 24 and had known Gideon Marlowe 11 weeks, long enough to know she liked the way he argued, and not nearly long enough to know what he wanted from arguing with her. "Miss Hartley?" He had stood too near the desk, close enough that the ledger pages were visible over his shoulder, her father's hand, columns of figures, the word insurance underlined twice. "I've come to ask your father a question, and I find I would rather ask you first." That is a poor beginning for a man who wishes to be thought honest. "It is the only beginning I have." He had taken a small brown notebook from his coat then. She remembered that with perfect clarity, the worn leather of it, the way his thumb had smoothed the cover before he opened it. He had not shown her what was written inside. "I have spent 3 months learning your father's business better than I understand my own estate. I would like to spend the rest of my life learning yours." "How you have spent 3 months learning my father's shipping insurance." The words had come out sharper than she intended, sharpened further by the ledger open behind him, by the notebook still in his hand. "Your Grace, I am not a fool, whatever else I may be. Your father's debts became the talk of 2 counties in August. You arrived in Bristol in September. You have dined at this house 11 times and asked my father a great many careful questions about continental credit and marine insurance, and now you stand here with your book of figures and ask me to marry you. That is not what this is. Is it not? Her voice had shaken, and she had hated it for shaking. Tell me plainly, then, what is it my father has that you need, and what is it you imagined I would not notice? He had gone very still, the particular stillness of a man deciding whether honesty would help him or ruin him, and choosing in the end neither, because he said nothing at all. The silence had answered for him more thoroughly than any confession could have. I would rather be a spinster, Constance had said, than your Duchess, your Grace. I would rather grow old alone and unremarked than spend my life wondering, each time you were kind to me, whether it was for my sake or my father's ledgers. He had closed the notebook. He had bowed, correctly, coldly. The bow of a man absorbing a verdict he believed unjust and had no grounds left to appeal, and he had left Queen Square within the hour, and Bristol within the week, and Constance had told the story so many times since, to so many drawing rooms, that she had very nearly convinced herself it no longer cost her anything to tell. The carriage home from the pump room present day. The carriage smelled of wet wool and Phoebe's lavender water, and Constance stared out at Bath sliding past. Honey-coloured stone, everyone's business known to everyone else by supper. You never told me the whole of it, Phoebe said, only that you refused him, not what he actually said. He said very little in the end. That was rather the trouble. Constance kept her voice even, a recitation rather than a confession. He came to Bristol the same fortnight his father's debts became public and started asking my father very particular questions about shipping insurance and continental credit, and then asked me to marry him 9 days later, with my father's own ledgers still open on the desk behind him. I asked him plainly what he wanted. He gave me nothing but silence. That was 3 years ago. Some things keep. Phoebe considered this with the air of a woman deciding whether to press further, and decided to. He asked after your father's health, once, as though once was already more than you were going to answer. My father is fine. Is he? Phoebe's eyes were kind and entirely unconvinced. Because you didn't sound fine saying so, and Mr. Hartley hasn't dined out in a fortnight, and you changed the subject the last 3 times I asked why. Constance looked out the window and did not answer, because she did not in fact know why her father had taken to locking his study door. Laura Place that evening. Josiah Hartley carved the mutton with more attention than the mutton required, and did not once look up while he did it. You were seen speaking with the Duke of Alderley, he said, in the tone of a man raising a subject he had rehearsed. Mrs. Fenn told her sister, who told our housekeeper, who felt it her duty to tell me. Bath has nothing else to discuss, apparently. Bath has a great deal else to discuss. It chooses this instead because it is a better story. He set down the carving knife at last and looked at her properly. Did he trouble you? No more than he ever does. She studied her father across the table, the grey that had crept fully into his hair this past year, the way his coat, once snug, now hung a little loose at the shoulder. Papa, you look tired. I am 57. Tired is my natural condition. You look tired in a particular way. The way you looked the month before the bank in Corn Street failed, when I was a girl, and you thought I hadn't noticed you stopped sleeping. She kept her voice light, because she had learned young that her father answered lightness better than alarm. Is something wrong with the business? Something crossed his face, there and gone, quick as a bird's shadow. Nothing that need concern you, a cargo delayed, a creditor grown impatient over a matter of weeks, no more. He reached across and pressed her hand, briefly, warmly, the way he had done since she was small enough to believe every one of his reassurances. You are not to trouble yourself over an old man's business affairs. Eat your supper. She ate her supper and did not believe him, and said nothing further, because she had also learned young that pressing her father past a certain point only taught him to hide things more carefully. The Theatre Royal 3 evenings later, the Dowager Duchess of Alderley had a voice built for command and no apparent interest in using it for anything less. Miss Hartley, Miss Ainsworth, you will sit with me. I find the box unbearably large for one old woman and her grandson who insists on standing at the back like a footman. She rapped her fan against the rail. Gideon, sit down. You are giving me a crick in my neck. Yes, grandmother. He sat. It put him directly beside Constance in a box built for 4 and holding exactly that, with no arrangement that did not press her shoulder near his sleeve. "I did not realize your Grace kept a box in Bath," Constance said to the Dowager, pointedly not to him. "I keep a box everywhere my grandson is fool enough to need watching." The Dowager's eyes were sharp and entirely unfooled by the deflection. "He tells me you refused him. He does not tell me why, which in a man generally means the reason does him no credit." "Grandmother." "I am old, Gideon. I have earned the right to be indelicate." She turned back to Constance with visible satisfaction. "Well, he wanted my father's ships more than he wanted me," Constance said, since there seemed no version of the evening in which she avoided saying it. "I saw no reason to marry a man for what my family could do for him." She expected temper. She got instead a long look from Gideon that held no defense in it at all, only something that might have been recognition, or might have been fatigue, worn thin around the edges. "That is a reasonable objection," he said quietly. "I did not make it easy to believe otherwise." The candor of it startled her more than an argument would have. Before she could answer, the curtain rose and the Dowager settled back with the satisfied air of a woman who had planted something and intended to watch it grow. Through the first act, Constance was aware of him the way one is aware of a held breath, his sleeve a half-inch from hers, his attention divided between the stage and, she suspected, her. When the players paused for a change of scene, he leaned fractionally closer. "You used to laugh at tragedies in the wrong places," he said. "Is that still true?" "I laugh at people who take dying speeches seriously. That is not the same thing." "No," the corner of his mouth moved. "It never was." She caught herself in the dark of the box, almost smiling back, and stopped herself before it finished. Number 12, the circus, 2 days later. The Dowager's card arrived with a summons rather than an invitation folded into it, and Constance, curious despite herself, went. "Sit," the Dowager said, from a chair positioned to catch the best of the window light, chocolate already poured. "I did not ask you here to discuss the weather, so we may dispense with it." "I gathered as much, Your Grace." "You think my grandson courted you for your father's ships?" The Dowager said it without preamble, watching Constance over her cup. "I will not tell you that you are wrong. I was not in that drawing room in Bristol, and I raised him too honestly to lie on his behalf when I do not know the truth of a thing. That is not the comfort I expected from this visit. I am not offering comfort. I am offering information which is worth considerably more." The Dowager set down her cup. "In 3 years, my grandson has sold 2 hunters, closed up half of Alderley House in town, and turned down every heiress his solicitor has paraded before him, and there have been several, Miss Hartley, some considerably better dowered than you. He has spent 3 years putting that estate back together with rents and patience and his own 2 hands, when the easier road was standing open the whole while, and all it required was marrying money." Constance said nothing. The chocolate had gone lukewarm in her hands. "I do not tell you this to persuade you of anything," the Dowager went on. "I tell you because you are a sensible woman deciding a question on evidence 3 years old, and I think you would want the newer evidence if you knew it existed." She smiled, thin and sharp. "What you do with it is your own affair. I am too old to arrange marriages. I've taken instead to arranging chocolate." The Royal Crescent the following afternoon. Mr. Bertram Coles walked at exactly the pace of a man who had never in his life been late for anything, and narrated the view as though Constance might otherwise fail to notice it. "The Crescent is generally agreed the finest prospect in Bath," he said. "I find it very fine indeed." "So do I," Constance said, because it was easier than explaining that she had heard the opinion phrased identically at 3 previous dinners. Beside her, Josiah walked more slowly than he used to, one hand resting on his cane rather more heavily than the cane required. When Bertram paused to admire a doorway, Josiah's breath caught. A small thing, a missed step recovered too carefully. "Papa?" The damp air, nothing more. He straightened and smiled at her in the way he had always smiled at her, since she was small enough to believe every one of his reassurances. They were nearly to the end of the walk when Gideon appeared from the opposite direction alone, and there was no polite way for 4 people converging on a public promenade not to stop and speak. Mr. Hartley. Gideon's bow to her father was correct, and his eyes, resting on Josiah a beat longer than courtesy required, were not. "You are not looking quite yourself, sir." "I am perfectly well, Your Grace." Josiah's tone had an edge Constance rarely heard him use with anyone above his own rank. "Merely tired. Business does not keep gentlemen's hours." "No," Gideon agreed, "it rarely does." The 2 men regarded each other for a moment, that carried more freight than the words in it. Josiah's pride bristling at being looked at too closely, Gideon's concern not quite masked by manners. Constance watched and did not understand what passed between them, and liked that even less than understanding would have. Heir's servant in Hartley livery came jogging up the pavement then, out of breath, with a letter held out before him like something that might bite. "Beg pardon, sir, come urgent," they said. Josiah took the letter, and Constance watched the colour leave her father's face as he read the direction on it. No more than a name and an address, and yet enough to undo him standing in the street. "Business," he said again, folding it away too quickly. "If you'll excuse me." He was gone down the crescent at a pace that cost him, leaving Bertram mildly bewildered, and Gideon watching after him with an expression Constance could not name and did not have time to study, because Gideon turned it on her next. "Miss Hartley." "Good day, Your Grace." She took Bertram's arm and left before either man could say more. Laura Place that same evening. Phoebe found her in the small parlour, staring at nothing, and required no invitation to sit down opposite and demand an account. "He has had 4 letters this fortnight that turn his face grey," Constance said, "and this afternoon a 5th, delivered by a man who ran the length of the crescent to bring it. And when I ask, he tells me it is nothing, in the exact voice he used when I was 9, and our old house nearly went under." "And the Duke?" Looked at my father as though he already knew what was in it. Constance pressed her hands together in her lap. "I don't know which frightens me more, that something is badly wrong, or that Gideon Marlowe appears to know it before I do." "Perhaps," Phoebe said gently, "those are not 2 separate frightening things." Constance did not answer that, because she had already had the same thought and did not yet know what to do with it. A card party at the Assembly Rooms 4 nights later. The set formed before Constance had quite decided whether to dance, and she found herself facing Gideon across 2 lines of couples with no graceful means of retreat. "You could have declined," he said as the music began. "You could have asked someone else." "I didn't want to ask someone else." The figures of the dance drew them together, hand to hand, and apart again before she could answer that. When they came back, he said, low, "I've thought about that evening, in your father's drawing room." "So have I." The dance parted them again. 3 turns, a change of partners down the line, and she danced with a stranger's careful hands, and thought of nothing but the next moment she would be facing Gideon once more. When they returned to each other, "I asked the wrong questions before I asked you the right one," he said. "I know that now. I didn't then." The dance did not allow for more. It pulled her away again into the pattern, and by the time it returned her to him, the moment had passed, and neither of them tried to recover it. But her hand, where his had held it, felt marked in a way she resented and could not undo by wishing. She danced 2 more sets that evening, with 2 perfectly pleasant partners, whose names she forgot within the hour, and went home turning over 11 words like a coin she could not decide whether to spend. Laura Place past midnight. Constance found her father's study door unlocked for once, and her father inside it, not working but sitting very still before an unlit fire with a letter open on his knee. "Papa." He startled, and folded the letter with hands that were not quite steady. "You should be abed." "So should you." She crossed the room and sat opposite him, uninvited, the way she had sat opposite him since she was a girl demanding to be told things. "What is that letter?" "Nothing that concerns you." "Everything that concerns you concerns me. You have not dined properly in a fortnight, you flinch when the post arrives, and tonight you are sitting alone in the dark, holding a letter as though it might strike you." Her voice shook on the last words, more than she intended. "Tell me." Josiah looked at his daughter for a long moment, and something in him, the last of the pretending, seemed to give way at once. "I backed a venture," he said, 2 years ago. A new ship, cargo enough to double what we'd made in a decade if it came home safe. I put more into it than I should have. I told myself it was prudent. The Osprey. Lost off the Portuguese coast in a February storm. 8 months past now, with half my capital aboard her and none of it insured to its worth, because I'd trimmed the premiums to fund the venture further. He said it flatly, a man reciting his own ruin to make it hold still. I borrowed to cover what I owed my other creditors from a man named Simeon Locke. And now he wants it back. All of it, within the month. Josiah's hand on the letter tightened until the paper crumpled. If I cannot pay, he has made it very clear he will have me arrested for the debt. A man of his standing can do that, Constance, and will, and enjoy it. She sat frozen, doing the arithmetic of it. Her father in a sponging house, the Hartley name become a byword in every drawing room that had only just begun to accept them, everything he had built undone in the space of one bad winter at sea. "How much," she said, "is the debt?" He told her, and it was worse than she had let herself imagine. "There is Mr. Coles," Josiah said carefully, not looking at her. "He has 400 a year and has made his intentions plain, and a settlement quickly arranged might—" "Do not." Her voice cracked on the word. "Do not ask me to sell myself to a man I feel nothing for, so you needn't ask anyone for help. I am not asking you to sell yourself. I am asking you to consider that we may have no other means left." He looked old, saying it, older than the candlelight alone accounted for. "I would not ask, if there were another way." Constance did not sleep that night. She lay awake turning over every name she knew with money enough to matter, and hated that only one of them arrived, unbidden, every time. Milsom Street the following morning. Gideon's man of business, Mr. Fenwick, had the particular patience of a solicitor accustomed to clients who asked him to do difficult things quietly. He had heard Locke's name 3 weeks earlier, from a Bristol merchant who mentioned Hartley, and unpaid notes in the same breath over a supper Gideon had attended for precisely that purpose. He had said nothing then, to anyone, waiting to be certain of the scale before he moved. "Simeon Locke," Gideon said without preamble, closing the office door behind him. "I want to know everything about him, what he's owed, by whom, and what it would take to hold his notes myself, without his ever learning whose money bought them." Fenwick set down his pen. "May I ask why, Your Grace?" "No. I ask because it will affect how quietly it can be done." Fenwick said it without offence, a man used to Gideon's economy of explanation. "Locke deals through an agent in Bristol, a Mr. Grimshaw. If the debt in question is Mr. Hartley's, as I have suspected for some days, it would be simpler to purchase the notes directly from Grimshaw than to approach Locke, who I understand takes a personal satisfaction in these matters that has nothing to do with sound business. Then approach Grimshaw this week. Whatever the price, within reason, pay it and structure it so that nothing in the paperwork can be traced back to Alderley. And if Mr. Hartley learns of it regardless, he won't hear it from you." Gideon's jaw tightened. "This is not a debt I'm collecting on, Fenwick. I am erasing one. There is a difference, and I want it to remain invisible." Fenwick studied him a moment, the particular look of a man of business permitting himself one personal observation before returning to his ledgers. "You went to considerable trouble 3 years ago, Your Grace, to be understood correctly by a certain family in Bristol, and were not. I merely note that you appear to be repeating the exercise." "Then note it, and do the work anyway." Number 12, the circus, that same afternoon. "So you bought his debt," the Dowager said, not a question, when Gideon called on her before returning to his lodgings. "I had it from Fenwick's clerk, who cannot keep a secret from anyone who feeds him seed cake. I would prefer it went no further." "Naturally you would. You have made an entire philosophy of preferring things go no further." She regarded him over her spectacles with the frank exasperation of a woman who had watched him grow from an unreadable boy into an unreadable man. "Tell her, Gideon, before she learns it from a solicitor's clerk over seed cake, as I did. If I tell her, it becomes a transaction again, a thing I did to be forgiven rather than a thing I did because it needed doing." His voice was quiet and entirely certain. "I would rather she never know it was me than have her wonder even once whether I did it to win an argument I lost 3 years ago." "That," the Dowager said, "is either the most honourable thing I have ever heard you say or the greatest foolishness. I confess I cannot yet tell which." Sydney Gardens, 2 days later. She had gone looking for the Dowager Duchess, for advice, for anything, and found Gideon instead, alone on a gravel path with his notebook in hand. Agnes, her maid, trailed at the prescribed 20 paces, close enough for propriety and far enough for nothing useful to be overheard. 3 years of careful distance evaporated the moment Constance saw him. "You knew," she said before any greeting. "At the Crescent. You looked at my father as though you knew exactly what was wrong with him." Gideon closed the notebook slowly. "I had heard rumours, nothing certain." "Rumours about what? About Locke? About the Osprey?" Her voice had climbed higher than she meant to allow it. "You've been asking after my father's health for a fortnight, and taking notes in that little book of yours the whole while, and I am supposed to believe that's concern and not—" Not the same thing you did 3 years ago. Watching, calculating what a ruined merchant's daughter might still be worth to you. Something closed in his face, not anger, worse than anger. Is that truly what you think of me? What else am I meant to think? You appear the very season my father's business begins to fail, exactly as you appeared the season his debts first became known, asking the same careful questions, writing the same careful notes. You never asked me what I was writing. His voice had gone very quiet, very level, the voice of a man holding something shut by main force. 3 years ago, or now. You decided you knew, and you have been deciding it ever since, and it is considerably easier than asking. Then tell me what's in it. For a moment she thought he would. His hand tightened on the leather cover, and something moved behind his eyes that looked almost like relief at finally being asked. And then it shuttered, and he only said, "Lo. Not like this. Not while you're looking at me as though I'm the danger and not the man trying to stand between you and it." That is not an answer. "No," he said, "it isn't." He bowed, correct and cold, and entirely unlike the man who had held her hand too long in a dance 4 nights before. "Good day, Miss Hartley." He walked away down the gravel path, and Constance stood alone among the Sydney Gardens' careful hedges, Agnes a patient shadow at her back, furious and frightened, and, beneath both, obscurely certain that she had just refused something a second time without ever learning what it was. Laura Place that evening. She found her father in the hall, a fresh letter in his hand and an expression she had not seen on him since the week the Corn Street Bank failed. "Grimshaw's clerk called this afternoon," Josiah said, unsteady. "The month I was given, it has been withdrawn." He would give no reason, only that the terms had changed, and I am now to settle the full sum within the week or answer for it in person before a magistrate. Constance felt the floor of the evening tilt beneath her. A week, not a month, a week. In fact, the reason was this. Locke had heard through the particular underground of Bristol commerce that Josiah Hartley had been making cautious inquiries about raising funds elsewhere. Locke, who collected debts the way other men collected grievances, had moved to close the trap before it could be sprung open, by someone with deeper pockets than he had anticipated. He had dispatched Grimshaw's clerk that very afternoon with the accelerated demand, intending to force Josiah into the open before any rescue could arrive. He had moved too late by approximately 4 days. Fenwick had already reached Grimshaw. Constance did not know this. Josiah did not know this. The ground had already shifted beneath them both, and neither of them could yet feel it. Laura Place morning. The letter from Grimshaw's office arrived with the ordinary post, unremarkable in its cover, and undid Josiah Hartley more thoroughly than the demand that had preceded it. "Read it again," Constance said, though she had heard it twice already and did not in truth doubt the words. She wanted to hear her father's voice steady around them a second time, to be certain the relief was real and not some cruelty of hope. Josiah read it again. "The notes formerly held against you have been retired in full and the account stands settled. No further action will be required of you in this matter." His hand, holding the page, trembled in a way it had not trembled even under threat. Settled. Constance, settled entirely, and no name attached to it. Grimshaw's clerk would say only that the sum had been paid by a private party who wished to remain unnamed. A private party? I have racked my memory for every man in Bristol who might do such a thing, and want no credit for it, and I can think of not one. Josiah sat down heavily, as though his legs had only now been told they might stop bracing. I do not understand it. I do not understand why anyone would. Constance understood, or rather she had begun to suspect with a certainty that frightened her more than the debt itself had done, because a suspicion that costly, if wrong, would make a fool of her twice over. She said nothing of it to her father. She took her bonnet instead, and told him she was walking to Milsom Street for ribbons she did not need, and went instead to find the one household in Bath most likely to know the truth, and least likely to have been told to keep it from her. Number 12, the circus. The Dowager Duchess received her without surprise, which was itself an answer. "You've come about the debt," she said, before Constance had finished removing her gloves. "I've come because I no longer believe in private parties who settle a stranger's ruin and ask for nothing." Constance sat because her legs had grown suddenly unreliable and looked the old woman full in the face. "Was it him?" The Dowager considered her for a long moment, not unkindly, but with the frank assessment of a woman deciding how much a person could be trusted with the truth before it broke something in them. "I made him a promise 3 days ago that I would not tell you," she said at last. "I find sitting here now that I have grown too old and too impatient to keep promises that serve no one's happiness, including my own. Yes, it was him. Every shilling of it, purchased through his solicitor from a man called Grimshaw, structured so carefully that not even Locke himself knows whose money ended his claim." She poured chocolate she had not asked whether Constance wanted. "He has sold the last of the hunters at Alderley to do it. 2 more fields let to tenants he'd meant to farm himself. He did not consult me on the wisdom of it. He rarely does when he has decided a thing is right. Why would he tell no one? Why let my father sit through even one night of that shortened deadline, not knowing it was already ended? Because he did not do it to be thanked, child, and he is frightened, though he would rather die than use that word, that if you learned of it too soon, you would believe he had done it to be forgiven, to buy back 3 years ago with this week's coin." The dowager's eyes softened just slightly around their sharpness. "He would rather you never knew at all than have you look at what he did and call it a transaction. He has had quite enough of being misunderstood as a man who deals in accounts. He would like just once to be understood as a man who does not." Constance sat very still, turning the chocolate cup in her hands without drinking from it, while something she had held rigid for 3 years began, very quietly, to give way. "Where is he now?" she asked. "Walking, I should think. He walks when he cannot sit still, and he has been unable to sit still since Tuesday." The dowager's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "Sydney Gardens, most likely. He has a fondness for that particular gravel path. I imagine you know it." Sydney Gardens that afternoon. Her maid Agnes trailed at the prescribed distance, near enough for propriety, and far enough for nothing useful to be overheard. Constance was grateful for neither quality, and had forgotten both within moments of finding Gideon on the same gravel path where she had accused him a fortnight before. "I know what you did," she said before any greeting. Gideon's face changed, not surprise precisely, but the particular stillness of a man found out in the one act he most wished to keep hidden. "Then I suppose my grandmother has grown tired of promises." "Don't be angry with her." "I'm not." He looked down at the gravel, then back at her, and there was nothing shuttered in his face now, none of the cold correctness of their last exchange in this same garden. "I am only sorry you learned it from her, and not from nothing. I had rather hoped you would never learn it from anyone." "Why?" The question came out rawer than she intended. "You could have told me, you could have come to me last night, when my father sat up believing he had days left and no means to answer for it, and said, 'It is already over.' Instead, you let him spend that night in the worst of it when the worst was already past. Why would you do that?" "Because gratitude is not what I wanted from you." His voice had dropped, unguarded in a way she had never once heard it. 3 years ago you asked me plainly what I wanted from your father, and I gave you silence, because the honest answer frightened me more than losing you did. I have had 3 years to think about what I should have said. I did not want to make the same mistake twice, solve your family's trouble and then stand before you with my hand out, waiting to be forgiven for it, as though your regard were a debt I could settle the same way I settled Locke's." He took a step closer. "I did not do it to be believed. I did it because I could not have lived with myself, watching your father suffer, when I had it within my power to stop it. Whether you ever knew or not. I know now." "Yes." Something moved across his face, not triumph, nothing so simple. "And I find I am considerably more frightened of that than I was of the not knowing." She looked at him, really looked the way she had not let herself look in 3 years, and reached out before she had quite decided to, and closed her hand over his. He went very still. His hand beneath hers turned slowly and closed around her fingers, warm and certain, and neither of them moved to end it. "I am not yet ready to say I was wrong 3 years ago," she said quietly. "I am willing to say I might have been." "That," Gideon said, and there was real warmth in it now, unmistakable, "is more than I have had from you in 3 years. I find I can live a good while on considerably less." They walked the length of the gravel path together after that, not speaking of debts or fathers or Bristol, his hand still loosely closed around hers. Agnes walked 30 yards behind them and studied the hedgerows with diplomatic intensity. Milsom Street 2 days later. Phoebe found her outside the linen draper's with a parcel under one arm, and an expression Phoebe had not seen on her friend in longer than either of them cared to count. "You have the look," Phoebe said, "of a woman who has stopped fighting something." I have had rather a great deal happen since Tuesday. Constance fell into step beside her and told her all of it. The dowager's confession, the notebook still unopened but promised, the gravel path, the hand that had not let go until it had to. Phoebe listened with the particular stillness she reserved for things that mattered. "And your father's debt," Phoebe said when the account was finished. "Is it truly ended? Fenwick called on Papa yesterday at Gideon's request and laid the whole of the settlement before him in writing. Every note purchased, every figure accounted, so there could be no question of anything owed to anyone ever again. Papa read it 3 times before he believed it." Constance's throat tightened, remembering her father's face over the papers, the way his shoulders had come down from around his ears for the first time in a month. Mr. Grimshaw's clerk confirmed it separately, unprompted. He said Locke himself does not so much as know the debt changed hands, only that it is gone. "So it is truly over." Phoebe's voice had gone gentler than her usual dryness allowed. "You may simply be happy now without watching the door for bad news." "I am not yet entirely certain I remember how." Constance laughed unsteadily and found it did not hurt the way laughing about any of this had hurt a fortnight before. "But I find I am rather looking forward to learning." "Good." Phoebe squeezed her arm. "Now, tell me again about the gravel path. I want the part where his voice went unsteady, and I want it slowly this time." Laura Place, 4 days later. He called properly this time, announced, expected, admitted by the housekeeper with none of the awkwardness of accident, and found Constance in the small garden behind the house, cutting the last of the season's roses. Agnes sat on the garden step with her mending, her attention admirably fixed upon it. "Your father has given me leave to walk with you," Gideon said, "on the condition I am given to understand that I return you within the hour, and do not once mention shipping. He is very particular about shipping lately." "I cannot imagine why." A smile, not the careful half-smile of the pump room, but something looser, more willing to be seen. He offered his arm and she took it, and they walked the garden's narrow paths in a silence that had none of the old strain in it. "I owe you an apology," she said after a while. "Not for refusing you 3 years ago. I do not think I was wrong to ask the question I asked, or to want an honest answer to it. But for deciding this fortnight that your silence about my father meant the same thing as your silence in Bristol. It didn't. I knew that somewhere, and accused you regardless, because it was easier than sitting with not knowing what else it might mean. I gave you every reason to expect the worst of me 3 years running. I can hardly fault you for expecting it once more." He stopped walking and turned to face her properly, and his hand came up, slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back, to brush a strand of hair from her face that the wind had loosened. His fingers against her cheek were warm and careful. "I do not want to be forgiven for a debt I never owed you, Constance. I would only ask, if you find in time that you can trust what I am rather than what I once failed to explain, that you tell me. I find I have grown tired of guessing." She did not step back from his hand. She leaned very slightly into it, and felt him go still with the surprise of being allowed. "Give me time," she said. "Not much. I find I no longer want much." "Then you shall have exactly as much as you ask for, and not a day more," he said, "because I have already given you 3 years, and I find I have very little patience left for giving you a 4th. She laughed. A real laugh startled out of her, and he watched her do it with an expression so openly fond that she had to look away first. Number 12, the circus, 3 evenings later. The dowager had contrived, with a transparency she made no effort to disguise, to spend the entirety of supper positioned at the far end of the table with her embroidery frame and a determinedly inclined ear, while Constance and Gideon occupied the other end at a distance close enough for private conversation, and not quite close enough for impropriety. A footman stood at the sideboard. The candles were lit. Everything was, by the strict letter of propriety, entirely correct, and yet the dowager's absorption in her needlework was performed so elaborately that both younger people were aware it was performance, and aware she was aware they knew, and found they could speak almost freely in consequence. "Your grandmother's deafness," Constance said, "is remarkably well timed. My grandmother has never once in her life failed to hear something she wished to hear." Gideon refilled her glass, unhurried, and there was an ease in him tonight she had not seen even in the garden, a man who had stopped bracing for a blow. "She informed me this morning that she intends to practice it regularly until I have said everything I mean to say to you. She described this as a kindness. "And what is it you mean to say?" "A great many things in no particular order, none of which I have practiced, which will surprise you, I think, given how carefully I have practiced everything else I have ever said to you." He set down the decanter and looked at her fully, the candlelight doing nothing to soften the honesty in his face. "That I have watched you across 3 dinners and a theatre box and a card party, working very hard to decide whether you could trust what you saw in me, and I have wanted every single time to simply hand you the proof rather than let you arrive at it alone. I did not, because I thought you deserved to arrive at it in your own time, and not have it pressed upon you the way I once pressed a proposal upon you before you were ready to hear it plainly. You have grown very patient, Your Grace. I have grown very tired of the alternative." His hand found hers on the table, entirely without pretense of accident this time. "I should like to show you the whole of it. Not tonight. Tonight, I find I would rather simply sit here and have supper with you, and not yet risk the one thing I have been most afraid to risk, but soon. Sydney Gardens, if you're willing. I find I owe that path an apology as much as I owe you one." "I am willing," Constance said, and found she meant it entirely. "Whenever you are ready." They finished supper slowly, talking of nothing that mattered and everything that did. Her father's improving colour, the dowager's latest campaign against a bonnet she considered vulgar, a book Gideon had been rereading that she had once told him, 3 years ago, she could not abide. At the far end of the table, the dowager's embroidery needle moved steadily, and her expression remained serene, and she did not once look up. And when he handed Constance into the carriage afterward, his hand lingered at her waist a moment longer than strict propriety allowed, and neither of them moved to correct it. Sydney Gardens, 1 week later, early evening. Phoebe had been persuaded, with very little difficulty being Phoebe, to walk some 30 yards ahead and admire the plantings with sustained and elaborate interest, leaving Constance and Gideon on a bench at the garden's quieter eastern end, with the full force of social convention nominally satisfied, and practically a fiction. The light was going golden long across the gravel, when Gideon finally took the notebook from his coat and, instead of writing in it, held it out to her. "You asked me once what was in it," he said. "In this same garden, though I imagine you don't recall the exact spot as precisely as I do. I told you not like that. I find I am ready now, if you still wish to know." Constance took it carefully, as though it might dissolve in her hands, and opened the worn leather cover. There were no ledgers, no columns of her father's worth. The first pages held nothing but ordinary accounts of Alderley's own affairs: rents collected, a roof mended, a tenant's difficult winter eased by a reduction he'd granted and never told his steward to record as charity. Further in, the entries changed. Dates she recognized. October the 4th. Red one, in a hand she now realized had always been careful rather than cold. She said she would rather grow old in a garret than marry for what I could not honestly deny wanting. She was not wrong to say it. I have spent the evening trying to compose an answer that is not also a lie, and have failed. She turned the page, throat tight. October this year. Saw her in the pump room after 3 years, and found I had not, as I hoped, grown indifferent to the particular way she holds her chin when she's pretending not to be glad of something. Locke's notes purchased through Grimshaw today. I have told no one and do not intend to. If she ever learns of it, I would rather she learn it the way one learns a thing is simply true, not because I confessed it to be believed. The last entry was dated that very morning. I am done writing what I feel instead of saying it. If she asks to see this book again, I will not tell her not like that a second time. Constance closed the notebook slowly and looked up at him and found he was watching her with none of his usual composure. Undefended, waiting, a man who had just handed over 3 years of himself and had no notion which way the answer would fall. "You wrote about a strand of hair," she said unsteadily, "before you had ever touched it." "I wrote about a great many things before I permitted myself to have them." His voice had gone rough at the edges. "I am asking you now, plainly, with nothing left in that book that I have not already shown you. I love you, Constance. I have loved you for 3 years in a fashion I told myself was over, and I do not wish to spend a 4th pretending otherwise." "I would rather be a spinster," she said, and watched something in his face brace itself, than marry a man I did not love completely and without reservation, and for no reason but himself. Her own voice broke finally. "I am no longer that woman, Gideon. I have not been, I think, for rather longer than I have been willing to admit." He crossed the small distance between them before she had finished speaking, and his hand came up to cradle her jaw, and when he kissed her, it was not tentative. It was 3 years arriving all at once, her hands rising to fist in the lapels of his coat, his other arm drawing her fully against him. She kissed him back without reservation, without the old caution, and the notebook slipped from her fingers onto the gravel path, and neither of them so much as glanced down at it. When they finally broke apart, breathless, his forehead came to rest against hers and he laughed, an unsteady, disbelieving sound she had never once heard from him in 3 years of careful correctness. 3 years, he said against her mouth, for that answer. Then you had better not waste any more time asking a second one. Constance Hartley. His hands framed her face, thumbs tracing her cheekbones. Will you marry me? Not for your father's sake. Not for mine. For no reason on earth, except that I cannot conceive of a future that does not have you in the whole of it. Yes, she said, and kissed him again to prove she meant it. Yes, Gideon, 1,000 times, yes. 30 yards away, Phoebe Ainsworth continued to admire a perfectly ordinary laurel hedge, with the focused attention of a woman who had seen nothing and intended to remember everything. Laura Place, that same night. She found her father still awake, a lamp burning low in the study that had held so much of her fear this past month. You have the look of a woman with news, Josiah said. He asked me to marry him. Tonight in Sydney Gardens, I said yes. I wanted you to hear it from me before it becomes the whole of Bath's business by morning. Josiah set down his pen slowly. For a moment he said nothing at all, and she watched something move across his face that she recognized, after a heartbeat, as the particular relief of a man laying down a burden he had carried so long he had nearly forgotten its weight. I confess, he said at last, that when he first came to me in Bristol 3 years ago, I thought him a fine match and never once thought to ask whether he was a good one. I will not make the same error twice, so I ask you plainly, and I want a plain answer. Do you love him, Constance? Not is he suitable, not can he provide for you, though God knows after this month I have learned to value that rather more than I once did. Do you love him? More than I have ever let myself say aloud, to him or to myself. Her voice caught. I fought it for 3 years, Papa, because I was afraid of being wanted for what I could bring a man, rather than for myself, and I would rather have been alone forever than make that mistake and never know it. But he never once wanted what I could bring him. He wanted what I could bring him tonight, a hand no ledger runs to. Then you have my blessing, though I understand you did not strictly require it. Josiah rose and crossed the room and put his arms around her. I am proud of you, not for marrying a duke, for refusing one first when it mattered, and for knowing the difference this time between a man who wants a fortune and a man who has simply finally made himself worth wanting. Laura Place the following afternoon. Bertram Coles received the news in his usual unhurried fashion, which made it somehow easier and harder at once. I confess I suspected as much, he said, turning his hat in his hands in the small parlour. From the manner in which you spoke of the Duke, even when you were at pains to speak ill of him. A woman does not go to such trouble disliking a man she has no feeling for. He smiled a little ruefully. I am disappointed, Miss Hartley, but not surprised, and I would rather lose you honestly than win you as a second choice, dressed up as a first. I wish you very happy. You deserve better than to have been anyone's second thought, Mr. Coles. I'm sorry for it. Don't be. I shall recover and dine out for a fortnight on having been very nearly a duke's rival, which is more distinction than I expected from the season when I arrived. He bowed over her hand, entirely without bitterness. Josiah's study that same evening. Gideon came alone and asked to speak with Josiah privately, man to man. I owe you an accounting, Gideon said once the door was closed, and I find I would rather give it to you honestly than have you learn the whole of it in pieces, as your daughter did. I know about the debt, Your Grace. Grimshaw's clerk confirmed it this morning, once pressed rather more directly than clerks generally like to be pressed. Josiah's voice was not entirely steady. You sold horses. Let land you meant to farm yourself. For a man you had every reason to think ill of you. I did it for your daughter, sir, not for you, though I am glad enough it served you both. 3 years ago I came to your house with genuine regard for Constance and a genuine desperation about my own estate, tangled together so badly that I could not, when she asked me plainly, separate one from the other. I have spent 3 years learning to want nothing from a Hartley that a Hartley did not choose, freely to give. He held Josiah's eyes without flinching. I am asking your blessing now, with nothing left owing on either side, and no ledger between us that either of us need ever mention again. Josiah studied him for a long moment, the same appraising look he turned on every cargo and every contract before he'd stake his name to it, and at last extended his hand. "You have it," he said, "and my gratitude besides, though I understand you did not do it to earn that either. She refused you once for good reason. See that she never has cause to regret unrefusing you." "I intend to spend the rest of my life making certain of exactly that, sir." Laura Place, the wedding morning. Phoebe arrived before the household had properly finished dressing anyone, and took one look at Constance, standing before the glass in her shift, hairpins scattered across the dressing table, and laughed outright. "You look terrified." "I am not terrified. I am, considering the size of the undertaking." "You are terrified, and it is entirely reasonable." Phoebe took up the hairbrush and began, with the ease of long practice, to work through the tangle Constance's own nervous fingers had made worse. "You are marrying a man who bought your father's freedom in silence and nearly broke his own heart keeping the secret. I do not think there is anything left to be frightened of, except perhaps how happy you are about to be, which I grant is a stranger thing to fear than most." "When you say it like that, it sounds almost sensible." "It is entirely sensible. You have simply spent 3 years training yourself to distrust the sensible things you wanted." Phoebe met her eyes in the mirror, gentler now. "He is not going to change his mind at the altar, Constance. He has had 3 years and a fortune's worth of chances to change it, and used every one of them instead to prove he wouldn't. I do love him. Rather absurdly, if I am honest. I did not expect after everything to feel quite this unguarded about anything." "I know." Phoebe set down the brush and began deftly to pin the first of the flowers into place. "It suits you considerably better than the guarded version did. Now hold still, or you shall arrive at that altar looking as though you dressed in a moving carriage, and give the Dowager Duchess something new to comment upon." Bath Abbey, 6 weeks later. The Abbey was full, fuller than it had been for any wedding in a decade. Half of Bath having turned out to see the woman who had once refused a duke stand up at last to marry him. Constance walked the length of the nave on her father's arm, past faces she had spent 3 years half convincing herself did not matter to her, and found Gideon at the altar watching her come with an expression that held nothing back at all, no careful correctness, no composure kept in reserve. Josiah placed her hand in Gideon's with a look that carried its own quiet blessing, and stepped back, and the ceremony that followed passed for Constance in a warm blur of vows spoken steadily, and a ring that fit as though it had been waiting 3 years for the occasion, which, as it happened, it had. When the clergyman pronounced them man and wife, Gideon did not wait for permission to kiss his bride, and the Abbey broke into an applause that the Dowager Duchess led herself quite without shame. Laura placed the wedding breakfast. The Dowager rose for the toast before anyone else could claim it, which surprised no one who had spent longer than an afternoon in her company. "I have known my grandson since he was a boy, who cried over a broken clock because he could not bear that something so precisely made should fail," she said, glass raised, surveying the crowded room with evident satisfaction. "He has spent the whole of his adult life since trying to make certain nothing under his care should ever fail again. I confess I worried for rather longer than I like to admit that he had decided love was simply one more thing to be managed correctly rather than felt recklessly." She turned to Constance, and her sharp old eyes were, for once, entirely unguarded. "Her Grace taught him otherwise at some cost to them both, and I like her a great deal for having had the courage to make him wait until he understood the difference." To Gideon and Constance. "May they never again mistake one for the other." Josiah spoke next, briefer, his voice not quite steady. "I built a fortune on knowing precisely what a thing was worth before I risked it. I very nearly cost my daughter her happiness, insisting she do the same with her heart. I am glad, past any accounting I know how to make, that she did not listen to me." He raised his glass. "To my daughter, who was right to refuse a duke, and righter still to unrefuse one, once he had earned it properly." Bertram Coles, seated near the back with a lady Constance did not recognize on his arm. A Miss Fairweather, newly arrived in Bath, and by his account considerably more amused by his narrations of fine prospects than Constance had ever managed to be, raised his glass along with the rest, and caught her eye across the room with a smile that held no rancour in it at all. Alderley, 6 years later. The notebook had a new cover now, the old brown leather retired to a drawer, replaced by one Constance had given him their first Christmas as husband and wife, though he still carried it everywhere, out of habit as much as anything. Outside the tall windows, the estate ran green and prosperous to the tree line. Fields let sensibly, tenants secure, a fortune rebuilt by patience rather than by any merchant's connections after all, exactly as Gideon had always meant it to be. Josiah visited 3 times a year and stayed longer each time, indulging his grandchildren with a shamelessness that would have astonished the careful, anxious man he had been in that Bath study 6 years before. Phoebe had married a barrister of good sense and better humour 2 years past. Even Bertram Coles, comfortably settled with his Miss Fairweather and a son of his own, sent Christmas greetings every year with no trace of old disappointment in them. "Papa's writing again," announced their eldest, Frances, Fanny, to everyone but her grandfather, who insisted on the full dignity of the name. A dark-haired girl of 5, with her mother's exact manner of pretending indifference to things she was not indifferent to at all, peering over Gideon's shoulder in the estate's sunlit morning room. "What are you writing, Papa?" "Down accounting," Gideon said gravely, and Constance, seated by the window with their second child asleep against her shoulder, looked up at the old joke with a smile that had lost none of its warmth in 6 years of hearing it. "Of what?" their daughter demanded, "since you never let anyone read it." "Of everything I do not wish to forget." He closed the book before she could press further, and caught Constance's eye across the room, and the look that passed between them held all of it. The drawing-room in Bristol, the gravel path in Sydney Gardens, the debt paid in silence, the answer given at last in full. "Ask your mother. She is the one entry in it I have never once needed to write down twice to remember." "I would rather be a spinster than your Duchess," Constance said for old time's sake, and laughed at his mock-wounded expression, and did not, for one single moment of the 6 years since she had unsaid it, wish that she had kept her word.